And when we started talking about this conference a few months ago, I wasn't wise enough to mention some work I was doing and a presentation I was giving at the Premières Assises de la Francophonie Scientifique, where I was talking about decolonizing the French language. And before I knew it, I was on the program. So there is very much that feeling today of being the imposter, because I wouldn't consider myself a corpus linguistic, corpus linguist. Linguist, yes, working on French. But that kind of French linguist who is working on their native language, but actually I'm not quite the right and the real thing, because I'm Belgian. And in Belgium, they don't speak proper French. So in a way, I've always seen corpora as my friends, because they could come to the rescue to tell me if my Belgian intuition were right or not. So yeah, I like corpora because they help me and prevent me from doing mistakes. Also, you normally say when you present something in a conference that it is work in progress. Well, I'm afraid what I'm presenting is not even work in progress. I won't tell you how I've been using corpora in my research, although I do. But it's more a progress itself. So it's part of my reflection over the last few months about decolonization as a linguist. You will be glad to know, though, that it's not my first presentation in conference, and I know that you have to have 3 points, and as a good sermon, they should start with the same letter. So I've managed that. And my first thing, I will speak about the context, which has led me to start thinking about decolonizing my curriculum in my research. Case study, well, obviously I will start from I know best, which is French, and French from a specific angle, which is French as a global language. And finally, I will come to corpus linguistics. I hope you won't be too disappointed then. So let's start with the context. Well, I've started thinking about those things last summer when we were all in the midst of those demonstration about decolonizing the curriculum, and it was a bit new to me. I'd never really thought about it, and to be honest, my first impression was, replace Chaucer by Zadie Smith. I don't think so. But there were lots of things I was not familiar with, like roads must fall. So I started reading a little bit, and I saw that actually it was not new that in 2015 at Cape Town University they had thought about it, but breaking statue, I don't like that. You should keep nice things, and maybe, well, you could talk about what they represent, not in support of them, obviously. And continuing my reading, I saw that there was maybe an approach that I was more sympathetic to, which was the fact that in post-colonial countries there had been at the turn of the century some reflection about how knowledge, local knowledge and practices could be integrated in the curriculum. And that was something I felt more comfortable with. And the reflection in this country has kept going over the last years, and I came across an interesting article about decolonizing the curriculum in the Time Higher Education a couple of months ago. And it was, I think, a very nice expression of decolonizing was not about cancelling what happened in the colonies. It was not either cancelling what happened in the West, and it was that conversation and that putting into context that appealed much more to me. And there are good reasons why we should think about decolonizing, and I find in a conversation on the higher education advance side about decolonization of the curriculum, and there were 3 reasons that were given. The fact that a colonial curriculum was unrepresentative, inaccessible, and privileged. Unrepresentative first, well, it excludes certain crucial narrative, and already if you speak more than one language, you realize that, they don't tell you everything. Like, for example, coming back to Michaela's waters, well, if you are reading French newspaper, the body is not the same as if you're reading the UK newspaper. I'm also married to a Serbian, and this is really interesting from a news point of view, because the things you have in newspaper in Serbia are very different from what we have in the West. For example, you will know, if you read Serbian newspaper, that the source of human civilization is in Serbia. My husband tells me that all the time. But they are also saying, he liked to tease me about Belgium and how bad Belgium was. And he told me a few years ago about the human zoos that existed in Belgium. Never heard about that. Well, it was not really a human zoo, but it was true that for universal exhibition, there had been natives brought to Belgium and, you know, put in villages for people to see how it worked there in the colonies. And many of them actually died because of the cold and things like that. So you are not always aware of what really happened. It can also be inaccessible, because if you present people with things they cannot relate to, well, it won't help them. And you probably cannot read that, and it's in French, by the way. So it says, nos aïeux s'appelaient les Gaulois, ils étaient grands, blonds, et avaient les yeux bleus. So our ancestors were called the Gauls. They were tall, blonde, and had blue eyes. That was actually the curriculum that was taught in the French colonies. And obviously, if it could be something, the first one, the little Breton boy, that's what they looked like before they all started wearing Breton tops. Well, that could work for him, but for the others, that was obviously not something they could relate to. And as a result, well, you kept a certain group's privilege. So this kind of curriculum is ultimately inaccurate. And obviously, well, what is true, this is quite relative, but you don't want to teach and to work on things you really know are not accurate. So I just think, well, if you are an historian, that's quite easy. You can come and revisit history, but as a linguist, how can it work for me? And then I started thinking, well, with the French connection, and if you think a little bit more, French and colonization, well, that's a good collocation, isn't it? So, well, when you're thinking about the French language today, well, it's always a bit difficult to know actually how many people are speaking one language, because it depends very much on which source you're going to. This one is the figures from the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, so they are widely optimistic. Basically, you are a French speaker if you're a native French speaker of French, if you know you have your schooling in French, but also if you say je m'appelle Jean, je suis 13, that would do for Francophonie. But one thing that is more interesting is that the number of French speakers in the world are actually more and more outside France, which is something that is more interesting. And it could become even more the case if we have to believe what Alexander Wolff, who is the person responsible for the Observatoire de la langue française, so they observe how the French language is developing. Well, it could grow dramatically, and the growth would be in Africa, on the condition, obviously, that school attendance works according to plan, because there French is acquired mainly through school. The language and its decolonization is something that is quite big in France at the moment, because Emmanuel Macron is quite keen on language. Emmanuel Macron has got as his main idea, I think, for his mandate, the French language. You know, all those presidents, they've got big projects, like, for example, Mitterrand, it was the pyramid in the Louvre courtyard. Emmanuel Macron, it's about language. He started a kind of big museum, Cité universitaire de la langue française, in an old derelict castle in Villers-Cotterêts. This is highly symbolic, because Villers-Cotterêts equates to a law in France in 1539 about the use of the mother tongue in law courts. What is that mother tongue? Well, traditionally, people have said it's French. That's not so sure now. It might have been the colloquial languages people were using rather than Latin. But there is a lot of symbolism in that. And I'm not sure if I can play a clip from the internet. Am I connected?
You're very welcome to.
Okay, great. So I'll try. So what I've been doing, I'm a bit technically challenged because I couldn't hold this the right way. So you see, that's why I'm not a corpus linguist. So this is a speech that Emmanuel Macron gave on the 20th of March 18. And this is also a symbolic date because the 20th of March is the Journée of the Francophonie, Day of the Francophonie. And it was a speech that was made in the French Academy that is well known for not being very open about, decolonizing the language. So let's try to see if I can show you the clip because I think it's nice to hear the man himself.
Laquelle en serait le centre.
Oh, it's coming out.
C'est la langue française elle-même
Oh dear.
qui est devenue le centre de toutes les nations et de tous les peuples où elle a fait souche, dans sa variété étourdissante. C'est cela la
Coming
francophonie.
out of the.
Ce continent humain qui admet comme constitution une grammaire
Oh,
partagée,
it's going to the
comme
Zoom
article
people.
de loi une syntaxe, comme code civil un vocabulaire. Et c'est fort de cela qu'aujourd'hui des centaines de millions de personnes affrontent le monde, le vivent et le racontent. Dans ce que Salas Tétier appelle l'autre langue. Celle dont il dit d'ailleurs qu'il ne sait pas s'il l'a au fond choisie. Et la France doit aujourd'hui s'enorgueillir d'être au fond un pays parmi d'autres qui apprend, parle, écrit en français. Et c'est aussi ce décentrement qu'il nous faut penser. Notre langue française, si souvent encore représentée comme un jardin aux allées rectilignes, est devenue ce lieu partagé qui a épousé progressivement les inflexions de la planète. Ici résonnent les paroles d'Édouard Glissant indiquant comme objet de la poésie le monde en devenir, le monde tel qu'il nous bouscule.
That's where you regret you didn't listen in your GCSE French classes. But fortunately, I've got a rough gloss of what he said. So basically, what he's saying is that France today is only one of the few countries speaking French, which seems to be quite enlightened. Another thing he says as well is that Francophonie only has one language, a shared grammar, the same law of syntax, and the same vocabulary. And that obviously is quite wrong because you didn't need to do a lot of research about French to know that global French has got lots of global features. Obviously, lexicon is always the most obvious place for it, and there has been a long interest in France in telling people about the languages of the region and the words of the region with Henriette Walter, for example. Now it has taken a more modern twist. Very recently, a couple of weeks ago, Mathieu Avenzi launched the Français de nos régions app, where you can contribute local words. But those local words come from language contact. For example, in Switzerland, they would have putze, to clean, where you can obviously recognize German. You can have archaism like septante that I use in my Belgian French, in Switzerland as well, but also new words. For example, feminization has been far more advanced in countries like Quebec and Belgium than it has been in France. You also have difference in the way people, those famous accents. And actually, you've got things that are fairly different according to the place where you come in Francophonie. So for example, for nasal sound, I've got 4, but you can do better. Some people have got up to 6 compared to the 3 of standard French. That idea of accent has been very much at the forefront of discussion recently with glottophobia, so the fact that you can be nasty to people because of their accent, the way they speak. And actually they've got a law since last year in France where you can be fined if you say nasty things about other people's accent. You also have morphosyntactic differences, but those are not as widely known. For example, the fact that in Quebec, for example, you would almost never use the go plus infinitive way of expressing the future when you would exclusively, use the go plus infinitive form when you speak. So there is a long tradition of Francocentrism, and basically it's everything. All the descriptions are based on Parisian French, and not Parisian French, but educated people in the region of Paris. Well, there are some glimpses of hope. Recently, last month, there was a Grande Grammaire de la langue française that was launched. 2,620 pages, 2 volumes apparently because it was too heavy. And it was quite hopeful because they were speaking about 30,000 of examples, so very much corpus-based. But what was a bit less interesting maybe is that, well, they were contributions by 59 linguists, but you can see that they are coming from countries that are very much Western and rich, so not very representative of the whole French language. It is in the description of the language that center of France. It is also in the teaching of language to allophones. So, for example, Marangoni studied the way the language was presented in handbooks in Italy, and what came across is that it's very much based on Parisian French again, even if there are some improvement with some Francophone contents, but this is the kind of Francophonie you have. So basically, it's, well, the fact that if you are in Belgium, obviously, you eat waffles. If you are in France, you eat croissant in the morning. But there isn't much about the differences about languages. So you've got the local features, but it is not represented in the description of the language. So this is a colonialist attitude. And in a way, it could go against French because, you know, you don't want to learn a language that is not relevant to your local circumstances. So this is where maybe corpus linguistic could come. And corpus linguistic could help for a defense and illustration of language. And you may have that intertextuality if you know something about French. Défense et illustration de la langue française. That was the name of a work by Joachim du Bellay, who was trying to, in the 16th century, to promote French as an equal to Latin by enriching the language. You're probably familiar with that representation of another global language, English, the 3 concentric circle of Cashreau. If in English there is an awareness of world Englishes, you even have journals with that name. In the French-speaking world, it's less obvious. And maybe we could have the same representation with Francophonie, with a small f. That would be where people are native speakers of French. Then Francophonie, that political organization of those people who decided to join in that French-speaking alliance. And espace francophone, well, maybe all those people throughout the world where you say, oh, French is nice, it's romantic, it's the language of love. So that inner circle, the Francophonie one, is quite well represented. You have Eslo in Orléans since the late 60s, so Corpus. We have a celebration coming in Montreal next September, courtesy of COVID. It's been delayed about the 50 years of the Montreal Corpus. But what is interesting is that those earlier corpus in French were actually initiated by English speakers, and there is a strong Anglo-Saxon influence. Obviously, since then, there have been some more local ones, like the Gare by Blanche Mavenis in Aix, Clapin, Lyon, CFPP in Paris. You also have in North America work around Ontario by Raymond Moujon, in Acadie with Ruth King. And we had a later start in Belgium with Valibel, so for the Wallonia, the French-speaking part of Belgium, and then my own CFPB, Corpus de Français Parlé à Bruxelles, with Andy Ster, where we are linked with the Corpus in Paris for comparison, and then in Switzerland with Offrum. For the outer circle, the representation of language in corpora is more patchy. Obviously, what has happened is that often what we had as testimony of other varieties of French was often like theses written by Westerners. And even if we have now a larger corpus, francophone corpora, they are often managed by Western researchers. Like, for example, PFC, Phonologie du Français Contemporain, they have samples of language of French spoken everywhere, but all the collection is following the same pattern devised by Westerners. So I would argue that we would need a joint approach, not a neo-colonial one, where basically researchers from the West tell you what to do. Because if we have those people from the global south also contributing, well, we can exploit corpora in ways that describe linguistic concept throughout varieties. It can be space also, but we should maybe think of decolonizing also in a different way, in the fact that you have varieties that are spoken in France, for example, in our Western countries, that are also heir of colony, for example, Français des banlieues in France. You could also integrate variation and cultural variety in the teaching of language as a foreign language, so that you can have contextually relevant practices, because there is no use to teach people in the middle of Africa things about how do I take the RER in Paris. It doesn't make any sense to them. So some personal action I'm trying to take, and that's what put me here in front of you. There is the Réseau sur le futur. The Réseau sur le futur, I started it with Lotfi Abouda in 2019, because I had started realizing in my studies, I'm studying a lot the French verbal system, and I did a corpus-based study with Hélène Blondeau and Mireille Tremblay about the expression of the future in SMS. And we compared corpora from Northern America and from Belgium. And I realized that there was a way of expressing the future in Quebec in informal speech that was ma plus infinitive instead of to go plus infinitive, which is the normal informal way in Europe. And I didn't know about that, and I'm a linguist, you know, I should have known. So it seemed to me that, well, we should learn more about those varieties. And for that purpose, I'm working at the moment with Emmanuelle Chang. It's all about Emmanuelle today. Emmanuelle Labeau, Emmanuelle Macron, Emmanuelle Chang. You're welcome to join us, but only if you're called Emmanuelle. So we're planning a specific workshop at the Congrès Mondial de Linguistique Française in Orléans next summer. And what we want to do is share with people working on all variety of French, and help also them, if they want to put their data in an accessible format, to do it in a way that will ensure maximum impact. And we didn't want to do it by saying, well, we from the West know how to do it, and we wanted it to be a real conversation. So we've got Renaud Gauvin from Haiti, who will be giving one of the talk on the workshop. And at the moment where I'm speaking, Emmanuelle Chang is also doing some work with the Dataton de la Parole, where they're training people who have corpora for languages that are not well represented, basically to give them all the impact, the minimum input to get started. And we hope, as in the wake of the CME MLF, to be able to do that for varieties of French. So how can we go forward with decolonizing corpora? Well, we want to make the descriptions of language representative, accessible, inclusive, and accurate. We want also to include varieties, not rely on one specific variety of the language, but also a varieties that will imply and involve speakers of those varieties, because they are the ones who know best when to use this feature, the ma plus infinitive. This is not part of my French. I don't know when it is contextually relevant. And it could imply also variation at a local level too. So what could it mean for us with our relaunch of Corpus Linguistic at Aston? Well, at Aston University, we've got a strategy that is all about serving beneficiaries locally while keeping an international outlook. So maybe we could kind of mirror that in our strategy. Maybe we could also include local varieties of languages and of variation. I know Danielle, my colleague who's just left us, wanted to do something about youth language in Birmingham, but maybe that's something we should keep doing. Also to include users of those varieties, not only as informants to provide us with data, but also as co-constructors by crowdsourcing, asking people basically to record those ecological data in their day-to-day conversation. And maybe, well, to go back to the waters and the fishing, having more a training them to fish approach that's just telling them, you do that, or we will do it for you, darling. So I started with my pilgrim progress. So we've got a busy map in front of us. So it will be up to us in ACL to choose the way. Will it be a wide one or a straight and narrow? That's still to see. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emmanuelle. That was fantastic. We've got time for some questions before we take our first break of the day, so I'll open the floor to our face-to-face attendees. Yes?
I was just wondering how decolonised l'Académie Française.
Well, can we start maybe from an easier point? Well, the thing is that you should be hopeful and come back maybe in 500 years, because recently they've made wonderful progress. Not that they've managed to complete their grammar, that's still unfinished, but for example, they've started to accept feminization of words to say, for example, well, a woman who teaches at university can be a maîtresse de conférence nowadays. I mean, it would have been a crime only 20 years ago, so you see things are moving, you just need to be patient.
Any other questions in the room? Oh yes, sorry, yes. Hello.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful and very interesting topic. And I recently heard lots of people talking about decolonization. But at the same time, we have the globalization, and people need to communicate and then try to understand, and then, you know, try to build some common language, something like that. And also, Chinese government to try to, you know, to facilitate, you know, 1.4 billion people to, you know, connected to the whole world, and they try to promote English as well as promote, you know, Chinese, you know, in the rest of China to learn Chinese as well. So, yeah, and I did realize as time goes by, when we have, you know, more countries learn Chinese, we also have different varieties, as well as within China, domestically, different places, they speak different ways as well. So that's just to fit that interesting topic here, and how do you see the world? And there are seems to be two types of trend a little bit clash there. How do we keep the balance?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because you have the practical aspect of it. Wouldn't it be nice if we all understand each other? But also the fact that with each vision or each language you have a specific vision of the world, and that's also interesting. I mean, for me, I would be very much in favor of people speaking more than one language, and I know it's not a very popular position in this country, but what is interesting to note is that France is doing quite a lot of good work on multilingualism at the moment. Not that they are honestly, you know, so interested in people learning other languages, but because they know very well that if they don't support Mother Tongue +2, everybody will learn English, and that's not good for French on the global scene. So they are about to take over as chairing the European Union, and they've just published, I think it was last week, a report about how to promote multilingualism. So I think that having one language, one global English is maybe useful, but we're losing lots of things as well. So keeping that awareness of, you know, there are different things, different ways of seeing the world, and whether you get that by studying Chinese, French, German, I don't think that's really important. But what I think is really important for us is to be aware that there is more than one pair of lenses you can use to look at the world. And, well, for some people it might be marrying a Serbian that will open your eyes or something you didn't know about your culture. But I think this is more that mindset where you're open to the fact that actually there are more than one way. And maybe I don't know exactly the one, but at least I can look for more. And I'm aware that, you know, there is not just one truth in global English.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, Emmanuelle. Wonderful, that was fantastic, and we're now going to take our first